G'day, Matt. Welcome to Landscape Photography World. How are you going?
Yeah, good. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure, pleasure. Why don't we start with who you are and why you do what you do?
So I'm Matt Palmer and I'm a photographer, but I was originally a graphic designer some 25 years ago. Started off in web design, and I joke that progressively throughout my career, I've made worse decisions to move towards less money. So I've ended up here in photography now, and I run a gallery in Brighton, Victoria with my partner, Mieke Boynton. And yeah, I think that's probably the overview.
Fair enough. So, what really started you along the path of getting into photography? How did you transition from graphic design into photography? Was that something that you found natural, or was it a decision that you'd made?
I think for me, it was transitioning in from website design into photography, sorry, into print design. And
Mm-hmm.
so I had this transition between being ultra focused on pixels and then going into millimeters as a standard unit, and then back into pixels again with photography. So it was a little bit unusual, but it basically came about because I had clients that needed sort of stock imagery but didn't want to have stock imagery. So
Sure.
I'd go out and quickly shoot a skyline or whatever I needed for a job. And then I progressively took on design jobs that were more photography focused. So I had a job where I was working for the Royal Children's Hospital Foundation. So I took photos of the kids there for medical research and ended up in a job at Brisbane Roar FC, so the football club, where it was a creative director in charge of everything visual. And with a sporting club like that means a lot of photography as well. So
Mm-hmm.
I was out on the field taking the photos, and I was doing the studio lit portrait sessions at the office of all the players. And alongside all of that, I was always shooting my own stuff as well, which for at the start was a lot of live music.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess there's a lot of correlation between the live music and the football. You've got to really focus on getting that fast action shot, and I guess freezing the motion is really what you're after. Landscape's quite a bit different. What led you into landscape, and how did you start making that transition?
Well, I think ultimately, when I was first acting as a photographer, so probably about 10 years of photography, I didn't take landscapes at all. And
Yep.
I was pretty much not interested in photography unless there was a person in it,
Okay.
because I was interested in knowing the person and their
Cool.
background and how to photograph them in a way that showed them. And but I think I was just comparing landscape photography to what I could see typically around Brisbane, which is a very suburban area.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I traveled overseas to Norway and Iceland, and then I was like, whoa, okay, there's something else here.
Mm.
And now I tell people that are in a similar position to what I was to find the character in the landscape. If they're a person photographer, there's people in the landscape, but they're trees or they're rocks or there's some
Yeah.
other thing.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. I think that's a really interesting way of expressing it. How did how did that sort of form, or that thought form for you?
Yeah, I'm not sure to be honest. I think it's just a matter of going out there repeatedly and trying to find things and seeing what draws you to something. And so a lot of landscape photographers I find they shoot very wide, or at least when they're starting off, they focus on wide kind of landscapes and capturing an entire scene.
Yep.
And I think from the start, because I've been focused on people quite a bit, I was drawn into the details a lot sooner than I
Okay.
might have otherwise been.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually use telephoto lenses for landscapes an awful lot. And it's always been okay, I can see that there's something within the landscape where I'm being drawn to the scene. But what exactly is in the scene is it that I'm drawn to? Is it the way the interplay of light touches that specific hill in the distance? Or is it the wider scene? Or is it that tree? Or is it the way that snowdrift trails off?
Yep.
So I'm always focused on the really specific details.
Yeah. Cool. Cool. And what is it that you're chasing in your personal photography, the stuff that you're doing for yourself? Is it projects? Is it just looking for those little details when you go out? Are you a planner, or are you more spontaneous when you're in the field?
So I'd say there's probably two sides to that, and one is the exploratory kind of photography where it's not for a specific project or anything. It's just I think it could be interesting, so I'll go photograph it.
Sure.
And for all of that, it's largely unplanned. I'll just look at the forecast and go, okay, that looks like it will be interesting in this kind of environment. So I'm just going to go there and see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I find if I plan too much, then your success or failure becomes determined by whether you get the shot that you planned for or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of the time, you'll get there and you'll have your thoughts in mind, and then your plan goes out the window because something completely different happens, or the fog is in a different valley, or any number of things or variables can happen and you don't get that shot. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
like to leave it pretty open and just be drawn in whatever direction the light and the conditions are drawing me to. But for my personal work in a broader sense, it's really project driven, and
Mm.
it's usually about telling a story or having a stance about something.
Yep. Okay.
And from that perspective, it's about taking the photography that's going to communicate those things.
Yeah. So, what part does pre-visualization play in those projects, as opposed to that more spontaneous? You see the light, and a subject, and you take that.
I find when you're shooting a project, if there's a lot of different subjects, you're usually going to stuff up a lot on the first few,
Mm.
whether it's a building or a person or whatever you're photographing. You usually want to have your first few subjects be rather sympathetic to spending maybe a little bit more time on them
Yeah.
and
Right.
shooting them in a lot of different ways, and then going, okay, I think that's the right way forward. And then you hone that in for everybody else. So there's a project that I photographed of abandoned buildings that I'm finally completing after just being in Iceland again recently.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first did that project, I photographed everything I could about the abandoned buildings and different angles and details and inside. And then when I showed some people that work, they were like, oh, you probably want to make it a little bit more consistent visually in terms of how you're cropping and composing these things.
Yeah.
And so I thought about that the second time I went back. And so I took my safe shots. But then I also think maybe those detail shots could still be useful in other ways. So you might show the building, but then show aspects of the building that's photographed a little differently. And with people, with a people project, you really want quite a lot of consistency.
Yeah.
So it's about working out what the style is and how it's going to say things. And probably my biggest people project has been one on Muslims in Brisbane that I shot quite a few years ago now. And
Sure.
that had deliberate choices like using black and white because some of them had such bright and colorful clothing that would have dominated the visuals of the project had I allowed that clothing to speak rather than the people's faces.
Yeah, and I guess you're going to have inconsistency where some people are really brightly dressed and others less. So visually, they would compete for the time and probably win for the time, the eyeball time, than the ones where people were less brightly attired.
Yeah, so I think for that one, I was thinking about what happens if all of these pictures are in a room and they're around somebody that walks in.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to see that they're going to be automatically drawn to the colorful person and possibly spend more time with them or be biased in some way by that. Whereas I'd rather people see it as a holistic message and then explore each part of it.
Yeah. How important is it to have projects to work on? Are you always cooking up the next project while you're still working on the one that you're on? Do you have I guess, a grab bag of projects that are in the back of your mind all the time?
Yeah, I probably have more projects than I've got time. So
Mm.
a lot of ideas just sit there for a while. And I try and have one or two things on the go at a time. I'm finishing up the Iceland project now. And part of that was because the second time I went to Iceland to shoot this project, and it was in winter. So there were a lot of places that I was inspired to go to and document. But when I got there, it was basically just a wall of snow and nowhere to stop. So it just wasn't safe to get to those
Sure,
places.
sure.
And so this time when I went back, I'm like, okay, I've got a few places that I need to get to call this project completed. So
Mm.
I'm not
I
sure if that
guess
answered the question because I trailed off there.
it's all right. I guess, is it important to you to have projects to always
Yep.
work on? Is really the key drive that I'm going for there.
Yeah, I think it's important to me. I think photographically, pretty much every good thing that's happened to me has probably been because I was working on a project. From ASH, which was documenting Tasmanian bushfire,
Yep.
that was Australian Photographer of the Year, which I'm very grateful and lucky to have received, through to some of my work in Muay Thai and the accolades that received and opportunities that gave me, as well as all sorts of things. But pretty much all of the things that really stand out were parts of projects rather than single photos.
Yeah, yeah. It also sounds like photography was a part of your graphic arts when you started. Was there ever a time where photography wasn't about art, or has it always been that way for you?
I'd say there's probably a place to take photographs without putting the pressure on them of calling them art. So
Mm.
there's a lot of work that we produce that's to meet a purpose, and it's very purpose driven and practical.
Yep,
And I
yep.
think that's completely fine. So I don't really think about whether it's art or not too much. I think there's a lot of leeway for either personal expression or to meet a project's requirements. But I acknowledge that what I do is probably art, and I just say, just remember that there's good art and there's also the possibility of bad art. So
Sure,
rather
sure.
than simply saying something you don't like and going, oh, well, that's not art, maybe it's just art that you don't like.
Fair enough, fair enough. How do you stay motivated? Is it the projects that drive experimentation, new ideas, and trying new techniques, or is it the more spontaneous work that you're doing that sort of triggers some of that?
Yeah, I would say it's projects and seeing if any of those new techniques can tell a story in a better way.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's been a lot of news. I don't know how well it's going to age, because it might be a bit of about a month old by the time this goes out, maybe. But of course, Sony have released a new sensor technology, and there's all sorts of things always happening in photography that take the game a little bit further.
Yeah,
And I know a lot of people were excited about the idea of shooting 120 frames per second, but for me, it's all about that sync speed. So being able to
yeah,
finally sync flash with any shutter speed and not lose power. When I was photographing people, that would have been number one on my list, not more megapixels or anything else, the faster sync speed.
yeah, right.
I think things like that, developments like that, are going to open up so many opportunities for creativity that we
Mm,
don't currently have. And
yeah,
then it's okay, we've got this global shutter technology, but where's that going to be in a few years, and what's going to happen after that as well? So
yeah.
it's an interesting time.
I think given that Sony develops most of the sensors for most camera brands anyway now, that I'd I'd struggle to see. I guess I can see why Sony would want to keep it to themselves, but I struggle to see why the others wouldn't be paying top dollar to Sony to get those sensors as well. And so I can see it spreading across each of the camera manufacturers. And you know, I think some of the stuff there, I agree with you. For me, 120 frames a second, unless I was shooting action, maybe surf and waves and that sort of thing, I might use it, but I get by just fine with 15, 20 frames a second.
Yeah,
I
I have
don't
to
know
agree
that.
with that.
Uh,
I think when I won Sports Photographer of the Year, it was about 5 frames per second that you could shoot at.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so I think the technology where it actually captures the frames before you press the button, I think that's a game changer for sports,
definitely
because I
for
always
sports
tell people,
photography. Yeah, because
yeah,
you're
but
getting that pre-save of the video. Well, I'm assuming it's just recording the video because effectively 120 frames a second is very high speed video.
yeah. So I think I always told people when they ask about my sports photography, particularly the Muay Thai, is you have to think like the fighters themselves and
Yeah,
preempt what they're doing,
yeah.
because by the time you
Anticipation is
press
a
the
big part of
button,
that.
you've already
Yeah,
missed it.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. If you wait for the action to actually happen, you've missed it.
Yeah, so I think that will change that, but I don't think we need 120 frames per second unless it's perhaps for a scientific purpose or something a lot more intricate.
Yeah, mate. Yeah, as I say, you get those super slow mo things at 400 frames a second and whatever, which look fantastic when you see, say, a balloon full of water getting hit by a pin and that globe of water before it dissipates. That it's interesting to look at, but I guess it's a fairly specialized video technique that, yeah, I don't know that stills photography really going to benefit from that kind of speed that much.
Yeah, but I'm open to seeing what happens. Somebody
No,
will find a use
absolutely.
for it.
Yeah. I'm all about advancing technology as well, though. The more that changes, as you said, the more opportunities you've got for experimentation and new techniques. If somebody hadn't seen your work, and I'm quite sure some of the overseas listeners that I've got may not have seen some of your work, how would you describe your style, and how do you think your style has changed from where you started to where it is now?
I think I've just gotten better at what I do, really, in terms of style. Like I think I've
That's always a good thing.
mostly seen the same way, but just been a lot more refined. And I think I was lucky enough to have some mentors. I shot for about 10 years without having anyone really look at my work because it was all commercial. The
Yep.
client was happy, so that's all that was necessary. And then I finally got involved with the AIPP, and I had a couple of photographers, Darren Jew, who shoots for Nat Geo, and Ian Poole, who was one of Australia's top judges of photography. And I was printing through them, so they would always take a look at my images every time I came into print and give me advice. And it was like, oh, your eye's being drawn to this place, but there's nothing to reward the viewer when you get to that spot, and
Yeah,
lots of
right.
different things. So I think I've addressed more of those visual things over time and become a lot more detail focused on like the 1 to 2% things that make things slightly better,
Sure,
and gotten all of the big problems out of the way. But then I always say to people, if you're not taking some bad photos, then you're probably not trying hard enough, because I think that's necessary to explore something properly,
yeah.
is to take some bad photos of it as well, because not everything's going to work out if you're trying things. So I still take plenty of those. But in terms of describing my style, I try and keep things as simple as possible. I try and make the picture about the one thing that I'm interested in.
Yep.
And I also shoot a lot of telephotos. You get a lot of compressions. I like to have big mountains and things look like they should look in relation to other objects.
Yeah, right.
So that's probably a summary, but I, I'm not sure how to describe my style. I'm probably a bit too close to it.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. How much do you think you would spend in terms of time in going through your images and saying, okay, well, talking about that one and two that you mentioned before, and saying, okay, this one, I lifted the tripod up or down by 6 inches and that changed the perspective or so forth. How much of your time do you spend thinking about that sort of stuff now compared to where you were a few years ago?
Yeah, probably to give you an indication, the first time I went to Iceland and Norway, being a people photographer, I didn't even take a tripod with me.
Fair
And
enough.
then to Iceland, I took two tripods with me just in case, because we were running a tour. So I wanted to make sure everybody else had access to a tripod as well. But it's, yeah, definitely slowed down and paid more attention while I'm shooting. So looking around the edges of the frame, seeing if there's any branches that are going to come in and bother me in post production, and just making sure all those little details are particular and done correctly. I find I do more of that if I know the shot's going to be good. And there's a lot of
Right.
times where I'm like, oh, I'll try this out, but I won't spend as much time on that, because if I do, then I'm missing the time on something else.
Yeah. You mentioned that a big part of your work is storytelling. What part do you think storytelling plays in photography in general, but also more specifically your work, in terms of the way that the viewer engages with the image.
It's probably a little different now that we run a gallery as well. Obviously, there's a lot of people that are focused on how easy it is to make AI images and things these days.
Sure.
And I'm not feeling particularly threatened by that because I think it's a really interesting tool, but also because I'm lucky enough to be in the gallery and people come in and they want to know what's happening in a photograph, or
Yeah.
they want to know about your experience of having taken it. For example, Mieke has a photograph of a tree with zodiacal light in it, which is basically like the light doesn't actually make sense to the photograph. It's light reflected off dust in space, and then
Yep.
it just happens to be behind this tree, and then it's got the Milky Way above it, and things like that. When you can talk about the experience of having been there and actually being as surprised as the viewer might be to see light in that position, and you can talk through like how you felt and what was going on and how you shot it, it adds so much more value than just having a picture of something that's pretty.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think in single landscapes, I still think even just having an experience that's connected to it is really important. And then for projects, you obviously have a lot more photographs that you can tell that story with. And when I say story, it might even just be explaining a feeling or how something is. It doesn't have to be a chronological story like we might see in a film or something like that. It can be a narrative in a broader sense than that. And projects, that's ultra important to have some sort of narrative that ties it together and connects all the images up. So I think that's really important.
Yeah. Cool. Cool. How do you define success with your photography? And I don't necessarily just mean financial success and being able to
Mm.
keep the lights on, etc.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a tricky question. When Mika and I opened the gallery, so this is going to become anecdotal now, we talked to a number of people that run galleries, and a few of them felt like they were trapped because they could only show the work that would sell. And it was usually like the local area and the most iconic spots.
Yep.
And we said at that time, we would rather go out of business than feel like we're trapped by our own photography
Mm, mm.
and feel like we could only show those things and not really express ourselves.
Yep.
So in the space, we're accepting of having images that don't perform as well, but maybe they mean something to us. So I think success is really just taking photographs that mean something to you. So you don't want to go out and invest a lot of time. And this is part of the process anyway, it's going to happen. But you go out and you take photos and you're like, I don't really feel anything about these photographs.
Yeah.
And to go out and have an opportunity where you come back and you're like, actually, I feel really strongly attached to these photographs. Like they're important to me. I think taking images that are important to yourself, that's my version of success, at least. And I think other versions of success probably come from that.
Yeah. Fair enough. Fair enough. Do you think the you mentioned the desire to keep things expressive, as you mentioned, as opposed to being more commercially accessible, or whatever the term might be, to the buying public? Do you think that is really driven an ethos with how you've set the gallery up and how you're actually running it?
Yeah, I think so. And it makes the whole experience more fun for us as well. And I think if we're having more fun and we're more attached to our photography, then we're going to explain it in a more engaging way with people. Yeah, I think that's been a really important part of what we do. And it's really enjoyable as well when people come in and they think that they've got an expectation of what a photograph could be or what a gallery could be. And then they have that expectation grown, or, oh, I didn't know photography could be like that,
Yeah.
or I didn't know you could photograph that in such a way. And
Mm.
even having more traditional artists come in and maybe look down their nose a little bit at photography and then leave going, actually, that was really imaginative and artistic and creative work. And maybe I've got a little bit more respect for that field of
You
expression
mean
now.
they come in expecting you to have just gone out there and pushed a button? Yeah.
Yeah, so they're probably coming in and expecting something a little bit more pedestrian,
Yeah.
and that's okay. There's people that are always going to want the local icon in the center
Yeah,
of the
well, the
frame.
iconic scenes
Yeah.
are iconic for a reason. If
Mm.
people engage with them, they look at it, and for I know for a lot of people buying photography as art for putting on their walls, they're buying it because it's driven by a memory or driven by a feeling that they've had in that place.
Yeah, and like there's also I've been to that place and I really want a
Mm.
photograph of it because of what it means to me. But we like to also be able to show a place that people know, but in a really different way. And maybe they buy it because of the feeling rather than the place.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. How do you balance the running the gallery and getting out and shooting? Because that you mentioned being trapped by being in a gallery. I've spoken to other photographers that have gone out of business in their gallery because they weren't getting out and shooting enough, or they didn't feel they were getting out and shooting enough, and they felt trapped by being in the gallery. How do you balance that?
We're, I'd say, unlucky and lucky at the same time,
Sure.
in that a lot of our business comes in about 4 months of the year. So we get really busy over summer when people come to do the outdoors walking and biking and all that kind of thing. And
Sure.
then we also get incredibly busy around autumn when people come to see the autumn leaves.
Yeah.
So during those two times, we're pretty much gallery bound, and we might get out of the doors in time to go for a sunset, or we might do a sunrise before work because the days are longer during that time.
Yep. Yep.
But ultimately, our shooting definitely goes down. But then in winter, it becomes really quite quiet. And one thing we learned from others as well is that you never know when somebody that wants to spend walks through the door. But we told ourselves that we weren't going to become preoccupied with that idea. If
Yep.
we want to shut the doors and go and take photographs, then that's what we'll do.
Yeah. Fair.
So we schedule a lot of travel in the winter months and also try and get out into the snow as much as possible.
Yeah. Cool. Cool. How did you and Mieke make the choice to set up the gallery? Was it just something that popped up in a conversation? Was it something that you'd always had as a plan together? How did the decision to do it come about?
I think we both independently wanted to open a gallery, and I was actually looking at opening one in Tasmania, where I was
Okay.
living before I got together with Mieke. And I was looking at Deloraine because I thought that was a pretty little kind
Yep.
of boutiquey sort of town, and it's in between a lot of interesting places. So
Yeah.
that's where I was looking.
You get enough tourist traffic there to make it worthwhile. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I was looking at that, but I also thought I should do my due diligence, and I've written off the mainland, but without actually really knowing that much about anything except Queensland, where I used to live.
Yeah. Fair
And
enough.
so I was looking at Victoria because I thought access to Melbourne is always a good thing. What is an area that could interest me that would work? And I looked at a whole bunch of different areas. And I'm like, okay, there's Bright. It's got access to three different mountain ranges within a short drive. People go through there to get to the snowfields. It just looks like the right place to do something like that.
Yep.
And I'd never been to Bright before, never seen it, just looked at it on some maps. And I knew Mieke was from Bright, but hadn't really talked to her properly. I just met her at a few events, and I just, thought I'd reach out to her and gauge how she would respond to it. And I thought, how would you feel about a photographer moving to Bright? Because I
Yeah.
don't want to step on anyone's toes or
Sure.
damage
Sure.
anyone else's profession or practice. And she said, I don't, you do whatever you might like, probably different words, but totally welcome to live here or do whatever, but don't open a gallery. And she had the dream of opening a gallery in Bright because this is her hometown for quite a
Yeah.
while, and had come back here from Western Australia to do that eventually. And then completely independent of that, just because we kept in touch, we ended up together, and we were like, okay, that's something that we can do and we can do it together. And there was real estate comes up in Bright, and it's pretty much gone before it even gets to the market. It's
Sure.
just somebody knows someone else, and they tap them on the shoulder and go, "Hey, do you want this property?"
Yep.
So something will close, and then something will open, and you won't even see an in between. So we saw a place actually come onto the market that was an old travel agent, and we are like, oh, we should look at this place. And it was the day that it was listed. We looked at it, and I think we made the decision that night to lease it, and we had to refurb it and everything as well.
Oh,
But we had to act pretty quickly because it's not easy to get commercial real retail property here.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so we'd really just jumped straight into the deep end, and I was lucky enough that I've had a lot of experiences, and so has Mieke. That I was like, okay, I don't 100% know what I'm in for, but I know that I'll be able to swim. We'll just work it out as we go.
yeah, yeah. Fair enough. How important is position in that, or was it just the in terms of the place that you chose, or was it just that's available, let's take it?
I think we've learnt that position means almost everything as we've
Yeah,
gone.
yep.
And we did choose a place.
Like location in real
Yeah.
estate.
So we're not in the busiest part of town, but we are across the road from the visitor centre and from the Bright Brewery. And we also get a lot of people that walk past when they go to dinner. And we're
Yeah,
not open then, but they'll see pictures in the window and go, oh, we'll come back to this place. So
cool.
we get a lot of people that say, oh, I looked through the window last night and now I'm here. So I always say people don't really plan to buy art, or at least not our art. We might have a few fans that are like, oh, I want one of your pieces one day. But
Yeah, right.
ultimately, people walk through the door and they make no personal commitment to buy anything. They just want to have a look, as everyone says. And then they connect to something. And we don't really sell artwork. We just say that the artwork sells itself and we help people if they need it.
Yeah, cool.
And we're just lucky enough that enough people connect to the work that they buy it and
Nice.
keep our doors open. We could probably do things a lot better, and we're learning a lot as we go as well. And we could probably be more salesy, but we prefer people to be comfortable visiting whenever they like
Yeah,
and not feeling like they're making a commitment by walking in.
yeah. I certainly know when I'm shopping, whether it's for art or just about anything else. I'm leave me alone, and if I want something, I'll come and ask about it if I'm not sure. But if I want it,
Yeah,
I'll
exactly.
probably grab it, take it to the counter, and just buy it.
Yeah, so our gallery is set up so we have a bit of an office at the back, and it feels a
Yeah,
little bit detached from the gallery. So we usually get up and we say hello to people and just welcome them. If you've got any questions, feel free to come and grab
yeah,
me.
cool.
Just to break down that barrier, because I feel like if you walk into a space and people out the back and they're doing stuff, it's not 100% comfortable to go, oh, can you help me with this?
Yeah,
So
right.
we do that introduction. And
Yeah,
that's when I see people that feel really hesitant to be approached. It's
yep,
almost like the defense goes up. And
yep,
then when they realize you don't actually want to sell them anything, or you don't want to ask what they're looking for and like lead them down that road, they go, oh, okay, it's just a photographer and they're there if I need it. And that's it.
yeah, cool, cool. One of the things I ask a lot of the photographers on the show is how they price their work. Do you have a sort of formula for that now, or is it just something that you take or have always taken by gut feel?
I think when people are starting off, they start with the old three times rule,
Yep,
which I
yep,
don't know that you can really do when you run a gallery because it's a little bit more complex than that. But we understood what our costs were, and that's also our weekly costs of actually having the gallery open as well.
yep,
And we
yep,
made a general estimate on how much we might sell and then broke down those costs over what we might sell just as a general thing. And then we had a look at what else was in the market and kind of more at our level in the market as well. So not like somebody at the market stall that just wants to sell volume or whatever. Some people they want to sell a lot of volume and they do it cheaply, and some people want to sell a couple of pieces and do it at a really substantial price. And we're somewhere in the middle because we
yeah,
don't really want to offend the locals either.
yeah. Fair enough.
We kind of like it that we're not cheap, but we're affordable for special occasions. So it's not like something that you buy and you can just dispose of it. It's a special thing, and it
Yep,
costs a decent amount, but it's not going to break the budgets.
yeah,
So that's where we price ourselves, and we just ensure that works for the business. And we have tweaked that a little bit as we've gone, and we print with We print some of our things with Inkjet Lab up in Brisbane with Mark Lutz.
Okay. Yep.
And I've done work with him for quite a long time because he used to print some of my things for weddings and sports and other things over the years. And he's really good about providing advice. And he's been in the business for a really long time, both as a photographer and a printer.
Yep.
I even went to him with our spreadsheets after about a year. And I'm like, these are our most popular products. This is what we're selling. This is how much we can expect to sell every week.
Yep.
These are our prices and what our income is. Is there anything that you see as a red flag or that we're doing wrong? And he was like, first of all, I'm impressed that you have all this documentation, because we try and keep all of this stuff so that we can learn what's going on as well. But there was only a few things to tweak, and we raised prices on a couple of different canvas products and things. So we don't 100% have it nailed down, but I think if you start at a healthy place where your business is going to be sustainable, then you can always adapt from there and learn new things, trial new products, and see what works. And you'll find that you sell more of certain things that you weren't expecting and less of things that you thought were a sure bet. So you just adapt as you go.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the important thing, is you mentioned that analytics side of the business where you are recording what's going on in the business so that you know what sells, what doesn't sell, or what, which then, particularly when you're a physical print business in a physical location, because a lot of people running their own sort of online print shop, they don't actually have to print anything until somebody makes an order. But you guys have got to have that stock or have that print available, and sometimes in multiple size and formats and so forth, different frames, etc. So how do you go about sort of making those decisions, or how did you go about making those decisions up front about what you wanted to actually have in stock in the shop?
So a lot of our sales are on demand as well. So people will see something on the wall and then they'll want it in a different format. So we do a lot of that. We don't have as much stock on hand except to display. And then we sell off what, like, people can either buy what we've got on display, or they can go, I like that image, but I'd like it presented in this way. And so that's a lot of the businesses, people that want something custom or like in one of our other sizes, or they see a print in paper, but actually they like it in canvas because they want to put it in the lounge room behind the couch kind of thing.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that. And then in terms of what we actually show, because one of the classic sayings in sales and particularly artwork and photography is you sell what you show.
Yeah.
So if you're not showing something, you can't really expect it to sell. And so we have a meeting every season where we're like, what would we like to get? So at the moment, we know that we're going to do an order of these acrylic blocks that we get.
Yep.
And we've got an order for some metal and a couple of paper prints and things. We have a temp folder and we just drag photos that we're liking at the moment that feel relevant to that time into there. And then we just get together and go, all right, what are we getting? And we have usually a pretty smooth discussion, but sometimes a bit of a very passionate discussion as well. But that's a good thing.
How do you get on when Mieke loves a shot but you don't like it, or vice versa? And how do you solve the impasse?
One thing that we've done in the past is we've chosen some of the pieces from each other's body of work to do. So we're like, okay, you've got a free pass to print anything of mine that you want to do, and that's that. But we are also very comfortable with saying, I don't understand that photograph of yours, or I'm not completely on board with that one. But if you believe in it, then I'll back you on it. And we do that a bit. And there's times where even Mieke's taken a photograph and I'm like, we need to get that in a gallery, and it has in the gallery, and it has to be big. We should do a big canvas of it. And Mieke's been like, yeah, I'm not sure about that. But then when we've done it, it's been a hit. So we trust each other's intuition, and even if we don't agree with it.
Yeah, I think that's really important. One of the other things that I talk about a lot to people that are running their own photography business is how you balance everything that you've got to do, because particularly running a gallery and likewise running workshops, etc., it can get very full on, as you say. It gets very busy at certain times of the year, but that process of taking the shots, getting the prints sorted out, marketing, etc., doing your financials, having those meetings, etc., can end up being very long days. Sometimes they're very enjoyable, sometimes less. But how do you balance everything that you've got to do, the marketing, the finance, etc.?
To be honest, I'm not sure if I found that balance just yet.
Okay.
Um, yeah, you've definitely summed it up pretty well, though. So a lot of people will come to me and they'll talk about becoming a professional photographer. And I think if you're happy where you are in life and you have a great job, then don't become a photographer because there's
Not if
so
you want to
many
make a lot
people.
of money, anyway.
Yeah, there's so many people either in the trades or that own a business that pretty much can run most of itself these days. And they love photography. The next step seems to always be, oh, if I love photography, maybe I should sell things or
Sure.
make it a business. That's once you change your relationship with photography, it's a different thing. So I'm lucky enough that I'm probably borderline obsessive about photography. So I'm going to do it no matter what.
Yeah, right.
And I'm going to do it my way no matter what because I'm pretty stubborn. So it hasn't affected my relationship with photography too much. But when you're talking about, okay, I've got to go shoot a wedding this weekend and then there's an event next Wednesday, I don't think that's the kind of photography that people get into it to do.
Yeah.
Some people are really excited by weddings and that's fine, but it's really hard work. And I think if you're making good money in the trades or in a business, and your idea of photography is, oh, I'm going to go to Iceland or Norway, or I'm going to travel into the Kimberley or whatever for a month and just shoot whatever I like without restriction, then that seems the better deal to me. Because there is a whole lot of work. So even with our recent doubling and tours, so it was our first international tour together that we ran,
Yep.
and we'd both done things in the past, probably not to the same level. And we learned a lot from that experience because basically we learned that while like I feel pretty comfortable in saying that the level of service that we offered is probably far beyond most tours.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're just 100% committed to making sure everyone gets what they want out of the tour. And it meant probably 13, 14-hour days for 10 days straight.
Yep.
And but by the end of it, we were completely wrecked. Like our immune systems, because we'd just been working flat out and loving a lot of it, but we were just completely wrecked. And we're like, I don't think we could run a tour that way again. But
Yeah.
we wouldn't want to run it differently than that and compromise. So
Yeah.
if we
You
ever
want to
do
put
it
everything
again,
into it, but you also need your sleep.
yeah. So there's a lot of realities about photography that aren't really surface level. And even what not going into too much detail, but just like obviously people see how much they might pay for a tour. But then we got home and we had 29 pages of zero reconciliations to do, all
Yeah.
in foreign currencies and with receipts that are in foreign language. And Mieke took on most of that, but there's so many things like that are a minor nightmare.
I think just one minor detail that I sometimes forget to do if I do anything overseas is dealing with the local GST, VAT, whatever you want to call it, and trying to claw that back from the local authorities before you leave is an absolute nightmare because, as you say, you've got to find all your receipts and sometimes they're not in the right language and you're sitting there going, okay, can I claim that one back or not?
Yeah, I guess the answer is we probably have a job that looks really good on the surface, but is also a lot of work that we don't really like doing.
Yeah, it's always the way though. Until you start to peel the onion, you don't know what it's actually going to contain.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to talk a little bit about Bright and the local area there. How has that changed the way that you shoot? It's clearly changing what you shoot because you're going out to shoot the local area, but has it made any difference to the way that you shoot at all?
Probably not so much from a technical standpoint, but in how I approach it, I would say yes. When I was in Tasmania, I felt very confident that I understood what the local issues were.
Hmm.
So I knew, for example, which forests were being logged, where there were illegal things happening,
Sure.
which places should be protected. I understood a lot more about the geography and what was special about different places. And so my photography and landscape photography had a really clear aim.
Yep.
And I would often focus on places that were probably deserving of preservation. So, like the Tarkine and areas like that.
Hmm.
So there was never really a question of, oh, what should I photograph or why should I photograph it? And coming to Victoria, I've never lived here before. And I didn't want to be that guy that comes in and starts preaching to the locals through his
Sure.
photography about how things should be done. So I've had to really slow down and go, okay, I need to understand what's going on in this place and what's different about here. And definitely the threats to this environment are very different from what's happening in Tasmania. So, for example, we've got the beetles that do rings around the snow gums and kill those off, or
Yep.
which are actually a native species, by the way.
Okay.
So that the beetles themselves aren't a bad thing. It's just the warming climate has allowed those
Increase the
beetles to
numbers.
thrive a lot more than they probably
Yeah.
should. And then the brumbies, that's a really big issue
A very
here.
sensitive issue for some too,
Yeah. So
because
I find that,
there's people on one side that want to keep them there, and there's people on the other side want to get them out.
yeah, so I probably fall on the latter side, but I feel
Oh,
that's because the argument is often phrased in very loaded ways
absolutely.
that are quite biased. So I think a lot of people, they look at it as we have brumbies or no brumbies.
Yeah.
And I'm an animal lover myself. And if I saw a Brumby in the wild, I would be amazed and want to photograph that. And I would feel some sort of empathy and connection to that. But
Yep.
at the same time, I see the argument as okay, it's Brumbies, or I think it's the she oak lizard whose habitat is being destroyed by the activity of the Brumbies.
Yeah.
And I'm siding with the native species that are affected rather than
Totally.
thinking of it as Brumbies or no Brumbies. And I think if people think about, okay, it's this and all of this native species, the argument's probably quite a lot different.
Mm.
And that's not to say that I wouldn't like some sort of humane addressing of that problem. And it's a really difficult one, and
And
I
I
don't
think
have all the
that's
answers.
a
But
big part of the problem as well, is
mm,
the way that the population of brumbies in the high country gets managed is pretty brutal from what I've seen.
yeah,
Yeah. Do you have a favourite spot that just keeps calling you back, that you always want to shoot?
in the local area, that spot
Doesn't
is
have to
Mount
be local,
Buffalo.
but
Locally, it's Mount Buffalo. So
yeah,
I feel like that's the mountain that just keeps giving. It's a very different kind of mountain than the other ones. So with Hotham and Falls Creek, we're talking about mountain ranges that used to be the size of Everest and over millions of years have worn down. So they're like an ancient mountain range, but very hilly, if I
mm,
can call it that.
yeah,
And
yeah,
then Mount Buffalo is just giant chunks of rock and the different interactions between rock and the weathering and also the snow gums and things that are on that plateau. There's endless possibilities up there.
yeah, fantastic. What about internationally or elsewhere in Australia?
Internationally, yeah, internationally, before the latest trip, I probably would have said Iceland, but I feel like I've had a bit of a disconnect with that after the last experience.
Yeah, fair enough.
And not because we didn't see beautiful things, but just because tourism has changed and a lot.
Yeah,
I
right.
was lucky enough to be there the first time when there was only about 200,000 visitors a year.
Yep,
And it really wasn't geared towards tourists. For example, there's a little town of Vic on the south coast that's
yep.
a very popular photo spot these days. And the first time I visited, it was the road, a few houses, a church, and a petrol station, and that was it. And if you were hungry, you had the petrol station, that's where you were eating. And now it's like a fully fledged tourist town with a massive, it's got the supermarket and the outdoor stores and restaurants everywhere and hotels and so many hotels. And it just feels different. So the first time I was there, like I was lucky enough to go to some of the iconic places where no one else was there.
Yeah,
like
right.
Soldier Lansfoss and Raina Stranger. I was there when there might have only been two other people in the whole place. And the
Yeah.
first time I saw Yokosalan, which is a glacial lagoon, I ran over the hill and there were just a couple of people in the distance, and that was it. And now you go there and it's not, it feels more like a theme park. There's just so many people and huge car parks full of buses, and everyone shuttles in and off. And it's great that many people are getting to see something that's so beautiful, but it really does change the nature of the experience of being there as well.
Totally, totally. What's your most memorable experience?
There's quite a lot because I always say being somewhere uncomfortable usually gives you the best images. I like to be on the edge of things, whether that's like a storm front or the behind of a storm or some sort of changeable environment. And I think that results in the best images. In terms of specific things, and I can't really remember too many except perhaps a couple of stuff ups here and there. So there was one time I was in Iceland and I was driving on Route 1 and it was winter. And I was like, okay, I'll go to the top of this hill and we'll just see what's going on around us. And we'll either keep taking this road if it looks like it clears up,
Yep.
or we'll go around a detour that takes about 3 hours. And I was really
Right.
keen not to do the detour because there were winter storms and things coming. But I didn't make it up this hill because I realized once the snow got a bit too deep that I was actually sitting on ice as well. And the whole road, it was like there was a mini temporal glacier over the road. It was like a giant slab of ice.
Yeah.
And when I was backing up, every time I backed up, I'd slip closer to the edge of the road, which was downhill.
Uh-huh.
And so I kept backing up, kept slipping. And I'm like, okay, we're not going to get back onto the road without going over the edge here. So we can either keep doing what we're doing or go off the road the right way. And so I swung it into reverse and put on the accelerator so I'd spin the car around and then drove off the edge of the hill. And I pretty much just aimed for where I could see grass because I figured if there was grass that I could see, then the snow was thin enough that I could possibly drive on it.
Yep.
But in retrospect, oh, incredibly dumb situation to get myself into because there could have been like little streams and things under
Yeah,
the
it could have
snow
been
or
bog and
rocks
uh,
or yeah. So I got pretty lucky on that one, but definitely a lot more conservative with that in future. But it's a very scary place to drive in winter if you haven't
yeah.
lived somewhere like Canada or somewhere like that. I'd gone from our summer in Brisbane straight into Icelandic winter and driving on the other side of the road and everything is ice. Like it's not even that they're going to de-ice the road. It's just the road
No,
is
that's
ice.
yeah, that's what you're dealing with there. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a really interesting experience. And whilst I made a few mistakes like that, anytime I've ever unintentionally gone off the road was actually at Cradle Mountain, which I was actually a bit annoyed by because I was like, how dare you get me like that? I was doing basically 10 kilometers an hour around a corner because I'm like, oh, this looks a bit slippy. I'll go slow.
Yeah,
And even at that speed, there was nothing I could do. I was
no
off the
grip.
road.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Any momentum with no grip is a recipe for sliding. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of hairy experiences like that that you get yourself into. But sometimes if you get out the other side unscathed, then those are the things you remember as well.
What do you think photography has taught you about nature?
I think photography, not so much teaching me about nature, but motivating me to learn about nature.
Okay. Yeah.
I've heard another guest that you had on recently that was saying, oh, it's not so much what they've been taught, but it's how they look at things. And I
Yeah.
think it slows you down. It makes you look at the small things a lot more. So
Hmm.
there's like different plants and interactions that you just wouldn't even bother looking at if you were just going for a walk or a hike or something that you then slow down and look at the beauty of and wonder how that was formed or what kind of rock that is or what plant that is. So I'd say it's been a huge motivator to understand what I'm looking at a lot more. And
Mm.
from that motivation comes a lot more knowledge about things as well.
Right, fantastic. How do you deal with creative blocks? Have you ever had one? Have you ever struggled with it? Have you got any strategies or things that you do to try and avoid them?
I probably did more so in design, and also I used to be a really terrible illustrator, and I was very self-aware of that. So I used to draw things that looked appropriate when they were drawn terribly, if I can put it that way. A long time ago, I had this goal. I was a lot younger and more prone to conflict and doing silly things. But I saw some kind of crazy art in an art gallery, and I thought maybe I should deliberately draw some really just terrible illustrations and see if I can get them exhibited somewhere. And I ended up getting them into semi-permanent, which is the basically the top design annual that
Yep.
you can be featured in. But yeah, those are probably the times where I've had creative blocks. I think these days there's times where I'm maybe not feeling it as much,
Yeah,
and that
right.
would be my equivalent of a creative block. I just don't really feel like shooting at the moment. That kind of mood. But I think once you're out there, that tends to fade a little bit. And if you remove the expectation of having to create something and just go, the worst thing that can happen is I go for a nice walk or I reconnect to that place, then it's acceptable to go and not even take any photographs. And that will get you through it a lot of the time, because maybe you see something that you're just like, forget about that. I have to capture what's going on right now.
Mm.
I think in the past, or maybe for other people, if you're just struggling to create in general, maybe developing a project from scratch, even if the project sounds like it might be a little bit of work,
Yep.
that can really give you some guidance. And you can approach the project even as a job if you need to.
Yeah. Okay.
So, say I'm going to document this local thing in my community, and this is how I'm going to document it. All right. If that's what you're going to do, you better get out there and start doing it. And then you work yourself out of it.
That's cool. You mentioned getting some other eyes on your work and some assistance in trying to develop that 1% and 2%. How do you see that people can leverage that sort of collaboration and build up a community of people around them that can actually help them? How important do you think that is, and how do you think people can actually achieve that in their work? Because one of the things a lot of photographers is that they're introverts, and they 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 might share their work on Instagram or whatever, but they might not necessarily show their work to somebody for critical analysis. And I think that's something that a lot of people miss out on, is that critical evaluation. I criticize my own work quite harshly, but I know other people will look at it quite differently in the way that they engage with it. How important is that, I think, or do you think, to helping people progress?
Yeah, I'd probably shape just one part of what you said, and that's where you said you self critique. I think we all self critique, and some of us a lot harsher than others. I know I'm
Yeah,
pretty harsh and go, what on earth was I thinking? Or what is this rubbish? And then 2 days later, actually, it's not so bad. But I think the value of critique is also telling you when you've done something really good, and maybe you're so inside of your own thoughts that you
yeah.
don't realize that
You're
actually
seeing
maybe
all the
something,
faults, but other people look at it and go, "That's amazing," you know.
yeah, maybe they see something special in a
Yeah,
piece of your work that maybe you weren't identifying. For example, of that, I had, there used to be print critiques that the AIPP used to run,
yeah, yeah,
and you could bring along prints and then the judges would talk about them. And I used to always see that as a great opportunity not to take the work that I thought I was going to enter into things, but
yep,
to bring work that I thought was on the edge. I
yeah.
don't know about this work, or I think it's a bit, I'm
The
not sure
stuff you're
about it.
unsure
So,
about.
yeah.
Yeah,
And there was one that I brought along, which was a Muay Thai image. And it was probably my fifth pick for a folio of four. And a judge said, I'd probably have to give it 100, because if I'm thinking about it as taking points away for everything that's wrong with it, it's perfect. There's just nothing wrong with this particular photograph. It's just amazing moment, all blah, 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 all this good stuff. And I had seen what I thought were the things to take points away from it, but they didn't care about that at all.
yeah,
They cared about the thing that had been captured. And so that really changed my mind about that image. And that ended up going to get a gold distinction which is like 95 out of 100 at the Nationals, and won a title from that and all sorts of things. So sometimes you need somebody else to actually identify the good things too,
Mm.
especially if you're suffering from something like imposter syndrome, or
Yep.
you're one of those people that criticizes yourself quite harshly. Sometimes the actual common sense from somebody else is actually saying, oh, actually, that's a lot better than what you think it is. But apart from that, I was pretty lucky to be part of a community, and I'm quite introverted as well. So I generally say I'm pretty good at talking to people, but I don't get energy from talking to people.
Yep.
Uh, so when I first engaged with that community, I gave myself a job because the worst. My version of hell would be if I had to network with people in a room and I didn't know anyone. That's my
Mm.
hell. So when I had a job to do, though, I had a reason and an excuse to go up to every person in that room and introduce myself and go, "Hey, I'm doing this job for the
Yeah.
community that we're in. So if you need anything, just give me a shout. What do you do?" Etc. Etc. So I think if you're struggling in that situation and you can relate to not wanting to just walk up to random people or
Mhm.
even message random people if you're online or something like that, then give yourself a job. Like you might volunteer to help out a Facebook group that you're in, help the moderators with things, or you might like run some sort of photo critique thing. Even if you're not the one giving the critique, you could be like, oh, well, I've got to find 3 good people that can talk about images. And then I've got to put a call out into our community for people to submit the images. And if you're managing those processes, you're naturally going to meet people and become more involved. And you might be somewhere at some point and somebody goes, oh, you that person that runs the photography thing that you organized, and
Yeah.
then
Cool.
that's a conversation in a different aspect. So as an introvert that was in the AIPP and gave myself jobs to do, I had lots of people that would visit me in Tasmania, even when I was living in the middle of nowhere. They'd be like, oh, I'll swing by, and built so many great relationships based on what was originally just doing a service basically, but it just gives you an opportunity to connect. So what do you do yourself to connect to other photographers? So you've got a podcast, and I think a podcast is a fantastic way to get to know lots of photographers because they're going to remember who you are and you've had an in-depth conversation with them. Is that something that was a motivator, or do you do other things as well?
Initially, no, it wasn't. Though in in part, when I look back on it, it was definitely something that was there in the back of my mind. But the reason I really started the podcast was because I was going nuts during lockdown. I had I think it was 165 days where you couldn't go any more than 5Ks away from the front door. And so it was, okay, how do I create and express myself and express some of what I want to do without, and funnily enough, I had actually been listening to a lot of other podcasts like Nick Page and Matt Payne and some of the other local guys that had done stuff in the past, and thinking, yeah, I could probably do that. And so that was one of the reasons why it started. But looking back on it, having that community of photographers that I've now had an in-depth conversation with, it's definitely changed my approach to when I'm out shooting and I see somebody else with a camera. In the past, I probably would never have gone up, and being the introvert that I am, I wouldn't have gone and said hello. But now I do in a lot more cases than I would have done in the past. And so it's enabled me to connect with a lot of people, but it's also enabled me to connect differently with my own work because it's listening to the stories and the inspiration that some of these people that I've spoken to, yourself included. It's been really fantastic for me to be able to apply some of what I'm hearing and what I'm learning out of it into what I'm doing.
Yeah, and I think talking about photography and showing people photography in an environment that I'd say is level if that
Yeah.
makes sense. So people are sharing from all sides of the table.
Yeah.
That's going
Yeah.
to help you learn a lot as well and develop your photography in your eye. So I probably phrase it that way because it can be a little bit uncomfortable for people if, say, for example, you're like, oh, I like this person's photography. I'm going to send them a whole folio of my images and just ask
Yeah.
them for
Yeah. Yeah.
feedback. Um,
I
whereas
probably
if it's
do
like,
that.
yeah, if it's, I'm going to get a bunch of people together at a cafe and we're going to bring 5 images each and talk about them, then that feels a little bit more inclusive and less like it's one person's job.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And if
And
somebody were to do that, then they would probably learn a lot and meet a lot of people as well.
absolutely. And I think that's a great way to go about it. Pardon me. What do you see as the biggest challenge facing photographers right now?
I'd say there's probably a few different answers. There's, of course, the AI, and I think that's a challenge for specific photographers who I think are probably already looking elsewhere for work.
Yep.
So I've done some talks about pretty much AI is going to kill off stock photography in general, I think, and
I
is
think
already well on the way to doing so.
yeah, I think fashion photography is in at real risk as well. I think
Mm,
the places, if you're looking for safe havens, landscape and real estate and event photography are probably so weddings and corporate events and those sorts of things, because you can't use AI to create somebody's wedding photos. Yeah, you could probably enhance some of them slightly, but I
yeah,
think
but the person still has to remember what's in the photograph as well. So,
exactly. That's right.
yeah.
That rhinoceros definitely wasn't at our wedding, you know.
So I think that's probably one answer. That's probably a bit more expected. I guess everyone's started, if even if they're not fully on top of everything that's going on, they've probably heard the whispers about that.
Mm.
And it's I think it's going to make some photographers their job easier. I use AI quite a bit already for some of my writing tasks, or
Yep.
you can use it to check the SEO on your website or all sorts of things. So I've even thought about doing a presentation that's just talking about how photographers can use AI to their benefit.
Yeah. Yeah.
There is a lot of ways that it can actually help photographers, not just kill them off. But I think also another challenge is both ourselves and the community in general. So I think my experience with the community has been largely positive, and that's because of different ways I've approached it. But there is also a lot of kind of some strange negativity in the community as well
Yep.
that I think some of us need to be more mindful of. So, for example, there was a girl that I heard of who had won a competition that I had judged, and then because she'd won that competition and some people didn't agree, she copped a lot of online abuse. And I
Yeah.
just think that's not really helping anyone. And it's possibly dissuading somebody from engaging with the community that possibly has something to contribute because they've had that experience.
Yep.
I know I've had pretty similar experiences as well. So people think winning Australian Photographer of the Year is the best thing. And it was good on some levels, but it also came with a whole lot of baggage that I didn't realize at the time. Like when I won that, I had at the time I was teaching at TAFE, teaching photography to students. And I also worked for a fashion brand in Tasmania. And that's the only work that I was doing, just those two jobs. And yet there were rumors going around the internet that I'd been poaching work from other Tasmanian photographers and undercutting them and doing all this really horrible business practices. And I think, like, why does this even warrant somebody's time to imagine this crap? And
Yeah.
unfortunately, there's a lot of that out there that you don't see. So I just think it's important for people in the photography community. Like, if you see people doing stuff, it's a good approach it as they're trying to do things to make photography better rather than necessarily pulling them down because they're doing it a certain way.
Yeah. Totally. What do you think about the future of photography?
I think it's largely exciting. I don't know what it is, but it's exciting. You know, we've got this AI stuff happening, and that's scary to some. I think that's really interesting, and I've started using it in a lot of different ways, and also for some side projects. And I don't call myself an artist for using AI. If anyone's stuck on what you should call yourself, I'd probably say if you want to talk yourself up a bit but still make stuff using AI, just call yourself an art director, because
Yep.
that's what you're doing. You're directing somebody else to create art, or a machine in this case. So
Yeah.
that's an easy out for you. You're directing art, but you're not making it, and you're not an artist. You're just directing it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm comfortable with that in what I'm doing. But you look at what Sony are doing at the moment, and Nikon are releasing the Z8, and I just think, who knows what we'll be able to create in future. So as much as it's a bad thing as well as a good thing, 10 years ago we didn't see drones flying around and taking amazing photographs and footage.
That's it.
um, it used to be that when you wanted to shoot something from the air, you'd have to hire an aircraft or a helicopter at great expense. And we do a little bit of that, but we're very selective about it. But all of these tools unlock new ways of looking at the world and new ways of being creative. And I can't really predict what the tools will be in 10 years, but I'm excited to try them out when they're here.
Definitely. Definitely. What's your favorite thing about being a photographer?
I think the thing that really spoke to me about being a photographer and becoming a photographer, like I was a graphic designer and I had some pretty good success with that, but I hit walls. So I'm like, okay, this is about as good at design as I'm ever going to be. So I've either got to learn something else that I can bring to that toolkit to become better, or that's just how good I'm going to be at that. And I don't think photography has those same walls. I think you can always be better, and you can always find new things to photograph and new ways of looking at things. So what I'm really excited about is, if I was in another field, I'd probably be able to tell you what I'd be doing when I was 60 years old, or, however old. And now I just think, who knows what I could be doing when I'm that age.
Yeah, right.
Like, I could be completely off the deep end, creating weird multiple exposures that are incomprehensible. I could be using technology that we haven't even seen yet to photograph atoms. Who knows? And that's what's exciting to me. There's just no limit to where we can take this thing creatively, and also that everyone can approach it in a different way.
I definitely look forward to your quantum photography.
Yeah, who knows?
Are there any particular photographers that you think I should be talking to on the podcast?
Yeah, I had a bit of a listen to some of your more recent episodes as well, because I don't want to tread over the same ground. And
Sure.
Mieke gave you some really good suggestions from our group Lumen Australis. So Chris Saunders and Ricardo da Cunha, but I'm sure they're already on your radar.
Yeah, they're on
I'd
the list.
say somebody a little bit more left field that probably doesn't get the attention that she's due, it would be Janine Fletcher. I had her recommended before, but she runs a little gallery in Ranfurly in New Zealand and has super creative approach to landscape photography. And she's also a judge with the NZIPP and has won many awards as well. Not that those things really are the be all and end all, but she's right up there in her craft. So I'd recommend possibly reaching out to her.
Fantastic. Thank you. I got the final question that a lot of people really want to get to the bottom of. Do you like pineapple on pizza?
So, the two-part answer. I like that pineapple on pizza exists, but it's not for me.
Okay, fair enough.
I'll go with the pepperoni.
You're pepperoni, not pineapple.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today, Matt. It's been absolutely great to dig into some really interesting stuff with you. Where can people find your work other than at your gallery in Bright?
Probably the easiest way is to go to mattpalmer.co, so .co, and that kind of links you through to other places as well. It has a bit of my work, it has a link to the gallery, and it also has a link to my YouTube, which I've neglected for a little while because it is a whole heap of work to do podcasts like this or YouTube videos and things. But there is a lot of good content up there, like image deconstruction and things like that could be of benefit.
Fantastic.
And thank you very much for having me as well. It's been great.
Absolute pleasure, Matt. Thank you. Thanks again for listening to Landscape Photography World. I hope you enjoyed the show, and keep listening because I'll be joined by some great guests in upcoming episodes. You can find my work and this podcast at grantswinburnphotography.com. I'm also on Vero, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. I'm Grant Swinburne. Hope to see you out shooting soon.